It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to fill in today's discussion not so much on the technologies, but actually on the policies, and the policies that help enable technologies to take off and really be adopted and applied in the way that we expect. And because there's so many examples of where we've seen policy to be necessary, especially when it comes to technology development, protecting intellectual property rights, and providing essentially the producers of technology with the incentives to innovate because you've enabled them to capture the returns to investments that come from their particular technology. So there are many, many examples of where that occurs, and also examples where enabling the private sector to go into certain types of technologies or certain types of activities that they wouldn't otherwise do on their own, where there isn't a priori a clear-cut case for profit making. And I think there's very many useful analogies that can be drawn between how agricultural technologies can benefit from that type of intervention when we look at how certain types of health products have been made available, where the ability for where governments have been able to sort of say, well, we'll make sure that your intellectual returns and your profits are protected for these markets if you let go a little bit and allow these technologies to diffuse into places that really need it. So targeting and being able to allow innovation and diffusion and adoption of technologies where it wouldn't otherwise happen just purely by private benefits is always a good role for policy to play. And as just been, and as Lloyd has just alluded to, just the push for investment, sort of making sure that there's enough push from the public side as well as the private side for certain key technologies. Or whenever I run into Phil Pardee these days, he tells me, and Phil Pardee is one who's done a lot of work in terms of agricultural R&D, he tells me that looking again at some of the data, they thought that some of the 20 to 30-year lags between the investments and the outcomes that are noticed in terms of improved productivity might actually be more like 40 and 50 based on some more recent analysis that they've done. And that already tells us that, the outcomes that we want to see in 2050, we needed to make those investments last year, basically. And so there's a very clear need for that. I know that there's been talked a lot about in this particular context, in this particular conference. And I think there's a lot of many good examples where the policy settings and I should say the development orientation of particular countries has affected the way in which they approach agricultural policies. I mean, the resource-rich countries, the countries that fall into these natural resource traps, they come across an abundance of natural resources. All of a sudden, policy shifts towards getting those rents from that particular resource. You start to grow a non-productive, non-export oriented public sector. You forget about some of your comparative advantage, and sometimes along the way you neglect those the education, the technology investments that would help. Especially that would help once the resource runs out and it helps you to get competitive again. So there's a many good examples where that has occurred. Examples of where that hasn't necessarily been the case, like Indonesia, which started on par with Nigeria in the 1960s, but because of some very conscious efforts to make sure that there was still enough investments going into agriculture, they were able to keep that engine growing while they were still also getting things from their extractive sector. So I think there's a lot of examples about how that orientation, and there's many, many countries that we know of very well where that shift towards trying to make those rents, and the politicians who want to use those resource rents in order to get their supporters on board will neglect some of those important ones. And there's actually some good empirical work, and I'd be happy to give you references of where people, when they actually look at the data and they measure sort of which are the most influential channels through which resource abundance tends to slow down growth. Surprisingly, some of the biggest avenues tend to be actually through the effect that it has on depressing investments, the effect that it has on closing economies towards openness. So the policy linkages that help, that slow down, I should say, growth as a result of this are very, very important. But I think there's always a risk when you talk about science and technology of always focusing on the productive activities. And I think from what the keynote that Ruth gave this morning and from some of the things that, that many of the presentations that have happened in the course of this conference, we're constantly reminded that there's this other sector. If we take, let's say, borrowing from the framework that John Hodnett presented in his keynote, if we think of the reproductive activities that occur within the household, the economies of care and nurture, and there's a lot of really good literature that goes into this, and this is where the domain where unpaid work of women plays a big role and basically provides that care and the renewal of the labor force within the household that enables them to then go out and bring in income through productive work. There's a lot of technologies, too, that are relatively low-hanging fruit that can make a big difference in that sector of the economy as well. I really liked Ken Davies' example yesterday in the parallel session where he mentioned these partially cooked foods that are packaged in a way that it reduces basically the cooking time within the household. And when we know from the data that when we look at time use data that that is a huge area in which time is spent within the household. So that's already technology that is there, that has been proven. And we've known from the many examples in certain talks about the clean drinking water, that perhaps is the number one time use activity when you look at the data, and the technologies for making that can be rolled out both at the systemic level in terms of providing the water as well as what can be done to purify it at the household level, I think are things that can be used. And usually number two behind water collection is the time spent for collecting biomass from the environment in order to provide cooking and heating fuel. And a lot of the technologies that we hear about, and actually there's many developing countries that undertake biofuels programs, renewable fuels programs, it's aimed at the transportation sector. Not a lot of it is aimed at the household level. And I always like using biofuels, and it hasn't earned me any friends among the Renewable Fuels Association of the U.S. as an example of where policies sometimes go against what the objectives sometimes are. So even if you have, let's say, within the U.S. program, a push for developing now these second-generation technologies that won't rely on the food crops, you still have policies in place that are acting against that. First of all, you give them tax credits on the basis of volume rather than energy content, which automatically favors the corn ethanol. You also, if your objective, let's say, is to reduce carbon emissions, you're putting up your high tariffs that are keeping out the Brazilian ethanol, which actually has a lower carbon content. So there's a lot of examples, both in developed countries as well as developing countries, where policies in place will actually retard the innovation and the rolling out of technologies that are going to meet your spoken objectives. And there's a lot that can be done with that. One good example that in terms of how policies keep out very useful technologies, as you know, if you looked at the World Bank's infrastructure diagnostic, you know that ICT, the communications technology, has been the fastest penetrating technology on the continent. It's almost like 90%. If you see the statistics that Vivian Foster rolls out. But there's some countries where those technologies are actually being kept out of the hands. And this is not Ethiopia being a good example, and not to pick up on Ethiopia, but it's just a good example of where it's one of the few places you can go and you can't get access to that technology. And we know by looking at countries like Kenya, where Safaricom has made cell phone technologies very pro-poor, allowing transfers of funds. You can imagine the ability to be able to have people receive funds directly, like what Ruth was saying, the importance of getting that funds into the hands of women. Those technologies are very useful. Right now, I believe India is undertaking a huge effort to get people identification cards for people who've never been able to have that before. Again, those technologies that allow people to be more easily identified, to be more easily targeted, are the types of technologies, exactly the types of technologies we should be helping through policy. I'm not going to go on for very long, but I just wanted to also point out the example of where sometimes we can use technologies to lower costs. And there is a high cost sometimes to low prices and providing cheap calories at whatever, regardless of what the external costs are in terms of health or environmental costs. And sometimes that happens because of a failure of policy. There's many examples, let's say in the case of the U.S., where the fact that education policy leaves much of the funding in the hands of school districts locally, the school districts then turn to the fast food companies for help, and they install the fast food machines and the soda machines that actually work directly against nutrition aims. I know that's a rich country example, but it's an example nonetheless of where a failure in policy has led to actually rollbacks in terms of nutrition outcomes. So just to state quickly, again, the points that good policy can help in targeting, it can help in the innovation, helping countries design and target their own, and make their own priorities in terms of which technologies they want first, for instance, the biosafety programs, looking also at the reproductive sector. What are the low-hanging fruit? What are the technologies that can help reduce the constraints there? And also making sure that policies don't also hide the true cost of always providing low prices and cheap calories at whatever cost. Thank you very much.